I decided to surprise my wife at her office where she worked as a chief executive officer. But the moment I reached the entrance, a huge digital sign stopped me in my tracks. When I told the security guard I was her husband, he burst out laughing and pointed at another man walking out of the building. My name is Harrison Cole. I am 70 years old, a former structural engineer, and I spent the last 3 decades of my life quietly sacrificing everything for my family. If you are watching this, take a deep breath. What I am about to tell you is a story of a betrayal so deep, so meticulously calculated, that it almost erased my very existence. If you have ever given your all to someone who took you for granted, please hit the like button to bring a little sunshine to this old man's heart. Subscribe to the channel so you do not miss my upcoming life stories, and tell me in the comments where you are watching this video from and what time it is there right now. It makes me really happy to know what corner of the world is listening to me. Today was our 35th wedding anniversary. I stood on the busy sidewalk of the financial district, staring up at the imposing glass and steel structure of the Aegis Tech headquarters. The midday sun reflected blindingly off the sleek, modern facade. I felt entirely out of place in my faded canvas jacket and worn leather work boots. I was a man used to the dust of construction sites and the quiet solitude of my basement workshop, not the polished marble floors of corporate America. For 5 years, Victoria had kept me away from this building. She always had a ready excuse prepared. Security is too tight, Harrison. The board members are very particular about unannounced visitors. It is just strict corporate policy. I never questioned it. I trusted my wife implicitly. I reached into the right pocket of my jacket and felt the smooth surface of the small velvet box. Inside rested a diamond necklace I had spent 6 months of my meager pension saving up to buy. 25 years ago, I did not have to save up for months to buy her a gift. I had a solid retirement fund, a healthy investment account, built on years of sweat and backbreaking structural engineering work. But when Victoria had a vision for a medical technology startup, when she needed capital and the traditional banks turned her away, I did not hesitate for a single second. I drained every single cent of my life savings to fund her dream. I spent countless sleepless nights in our damp, poorly lit basement, writing the complex core architectural algorithm that would eventually become the technological foundation of Aegis Tech. I remembered the smell of the ozone, the hum of the old server racks I had salvaged from junkyards. I remembered holding our son Preston in one arm while typing lines of code with my free hand, because Victoria was always too busy networking at expensive downtown restaurants. I gave up my career, my friends, and my own ambitions to be the invisible pillar holding up her towering success. I never asked for stock options. I never demanded a seat on the board of directors. I simply wanted to see my wife succeed, believing that her success was our shared success. I built the engine with my own 2 hands. She drove the car. And as the company grew into a multi-million-dollar enterprise, I quietly stepped back into the shadows, perfectly content to watch my wife shine in the spotlight. Pushing through the heavy revolving glass doors, I stepped into the sprawling, cavernous lobby. The air conditioning was crisp, smelling faintly of expensive cologne and freshly polished stone. I watched a group of young analysts walk past me, laughing and holding expensive coffees. They were probably discussing the massive bonuses they would receive when Aegis Tech went public next month. They had no idea that the very software they were selling was born in an unfinished basement by a man who now had to budget his weekly grocery runs just to afford a modest anniversary gift. Young executives in tailored designer suits rushed past me, talking rapidly into their phones, discussing market shares and profit margins. No one paid any attention to the old man standing near the entrance. I walked toward the central reception area, intending to leave the velvet box with her personal assistant, if she was too busy for a quick anniversary lunch date. My hands, calloused and heavily scarred from decades of hard physical labor, gripped the small box tightly. My heart was beating with a quiet, steady anticipation. 35 years. We had weathered terrible financial storms, raised our son Preston together, and built a corporate empire even if my name was nowhere to be found on the glossy company letterhead. But as I approached the main circular security desk, something caught my eye. Something that made my lungs seize and the blood literally freeze in my veins. Suspended above the expansive reception desk was a massive digital billboard easily 20 feet wide and glowing with high-definition colors. The screen was playing a beautifully produced looping promotional video for the company's upcoming initial public offering on the stock exchange. I stopped dead in my tracks. The breath hitched in my throat. Displayed in towering, elegant letters across the screen were the words Aegis Tech Initial Public Offering, led by power couple Victoria and Maxwell Thorne. Beneath the glowing text was a crystal-clear, larger-than-life photograph of my wife. She was wearing the elegant white designer business suit I had carefully ironed for her just 2 days ago. But she was not standing alone in the picture. Her arms were wrapped intimately around the waist of a tall, distinguished-looking man with perfectly styled silver hair. He was leaning in his face pressed against hers, in a pose of absolute, undeniable familiarity. It was a pose reserved strictly for a husband and a wife. The man was smiling, radiating confidence and ownership, while Victoria looked up at him with pure adoration. I read the scrolling text at the bottom of the giant screen. Join founders Victoria and Maxwell Thorne as they ring the opening bell on Wall Street. Founders. The word echoed in my mind like a cruel joke. Maxwell Thorne did not found anything. He joined the company a decade ago as a financial consultant. I was the one who mortgaged our house twice to keep the servers running during the early days. Yet there he was, standing tall, his hand resting possessively on Victoria's hip, claiming my life's work and my wife as his own. I stared unblinking at the name displayed on the screen. Maxwell Thorne and Victoria Thorne. Thorne. Her maiden name was Victoria Evans. Her married name for 35 unbroken years was Victoria Cole. Why was she claiming the last name of the man holding her? Why was she publicly presenting herself to the entire financial world as the wife of her chief financial officer? My mind desperately scrambled for a logical, innocent explanation. Perhaps it was a bizarre marketing gimmick. A terrible mistake by the corporate media department. A random corporate photoshoot taken completely out of context by an overly ambitious advertising agency. But the raw intimacy in her eyes, the genuine radiant smile she directed at this Maxwell Thorne, it was not acting. It was a look of pure devotion, a look she had not given me in over a full decade. I remembered how she had rushed out of the house that morning, kissing my cheek with cold distraction, claiming she had a critical board meeting regarding the public listing. She did not mention our anniversary. She did not mention a photoshoot. She only mentioned the future of the company. The physical impact of that towering image hit my 70-year-old body harder than any falling steel beam ever could. My chest tightened painfully, a sharp ache radiating down my left arm. My hands began to shake uncontrollably. The small velvet box, the one containing 6 months of my meager pension, the one representing 35 years of blind loyalty, empty bank accounts, and silent sacrifices, slipped from my trembling, calloused fingers. It hit the polished marble floor with a sharp, echoing crack that seemed to cut through the ambient noise of the busy lobby. The sound snapped me back to reality, pulling me out of the paralyzing fog of absolute shock. I looked down at the velvet box. It had popped open upon impact, the delicate diamond necklace spilling out onto the cold stone floor, catching the overhead lights in a mocking sparkle. I did not bend down to pick it up. I could not move my legs. I just stood there, staring up at the 20-foot lie towering over me, feeling the foundations of my entire existence crumbling beneath my feet. I felt a heavy, authoritative presence approaching rapidly from my left side. A tall, broad-shouldered security guard in a crisp, dark uniform stepped directly into my peripheral vision, his hand resting casually on the radio clipped to his belt. He looked down at the dropped jewelry box on the floor, then slowly looked up at my faded canvas jacket and worn boots. His eyes narrowed with deep suspicion and open disdain. He did not see the man who had funded the very building he was standing in. He just saw a confused, out-of-place old man making a mess in a high-end corporate lobby. He cleared his throat loudly, preparing to speak, completely unaware that his next actions would ignite a fire inside me that would eventually burn this entire empire to the ground. The guard stood over me, his broad shadow completely blocking the harsh, blinding overhead lights of the sprawling corporate lobby. He crossed his massive arms tightly over his broad chest, looking down from the scattered, glittering necklace on the cold marble floor, back up to my aged-lined face. "Can I help you with something, sir?" he asked. His tone was not helpful in the slightest. It was the harsh, aggressively clipped tone you use when dealing with a vagrant who wandered through the wrong doors. I slowly bent down. My bare knees ached terribly, a sharp physical reminder of 30 brutal years spent carrying heavy steel blueprints, pouring concrete, and crawling through damp foundation trenches to provide for my only family. I picked up the small scuffed velvet box from the cold stone floor. Then, with shaking calloused fingers, I carefully gathered the diamond necklace I had sacrificed so much to afford. I stood back up, ignoring the shooting pain in my lower back, and looked the young, arrogant guard directly in the eye. "I am here to see Victoria," I said, forcing myself to keep my voice absolutely steady, despite the storm raging inside my chest. "Victoria Cole. I am her husband." The guard stared at me for a long, silent moment. His eyes traveled over my faded canvas jacket, my stained denim jeans, and my worn leather work boots. Then a slow, mocking smile spread across his clean-shaven face. A short, booming bark of laughter suddenly escaped his lips, echoing loudly in the cavernous reception area. He shook his head, shifting his weight from one foot to the other, in sheer amusement. "Look, buddy," he said, his voice dripping with absolute condescension. "I do not know what kind of pathetic scam you are trying to pull today, but you definitely picked the wrong building. Mrs. Thorne does not have time for panhandlers." I narrowed my eyes, feeling a sudden sharp sting right in the center of my chest. "Mrs. Thorne," I repeated softly, testing the entirely foreign name on my tongue. The guard pointed a thick, accusatory finger toward the towering, revolving glass doors directly behind me. "Yes, Mrs. Thorne. And if you are going to blindly stalk someone, you should at least do your basic research first. Her husband is Maxwell Thorne, our chief financial officer. In fact, Mr. and Mrs. Thorne just walked out of those very doors exactly 10 minutes ago. They took the Black Company town car to celebrate the upcoming initial public offering at a very expensive downtown restaurant. Now I am going to have to ask you to leave the private premises immediately before I call the local police and have you forcefully removed for trespassing." I could have screamed at the top of my lungs right then and there. I could have thrown a massive, embarrassing fit, demanded he immediately call the executive suite, and forced them to look at my legal driver's license. I could have boldly told this arrogant kid that the very ground he proudly stood on was paid for by the literal sweat of my brow and the total liquidation of my hard-earned retirement accounts decades ago. But I did not do any of that. 30 years on brutal construction sites had taught me one fundamental truth about structural integrity. When a massive building is violently collapsing, you do not yell at the expanding cracks in the drywall. You step back quietly, expertly assess the shifting foundation, and figure out exactly how to safely bring the entire structure down to the ground without getting crushed in the falling rubble. I looked at the guard's smug face, then slowly gazed back up at the massive digital billboard suspended above us where Victoria smiled so radiantly beside her supposed husband. I simply nodded my head once. My complete silence spoke volumes. It was the deep, resonant silence of a stoic man who worked with his calloused hands. It was the silence of a man who implicitly understood the vast difference between cheap, flashy talk and solid, heavy steel. They belonged to a shallow, glittering world of empty Wall Street promises, glossy public relations, spin, and fake practiced smiles. I belonged to the harsh, real world. The world where a man's word was his unbreakable bond, and where absolute trust was something you proved through decades of silent, unwavering sacrifice. Without saying another word to the overly confident guard, I placed the velvet box carefully back into my right jacket pocket. My jaw tightened painfully as I fought the sudden violent urge to smash the nearby glass display case with my bare fists. Instead, I turned around and began the long, agonizing walk back toward the grand entrance. Every single step I took felt heavier than the last. The young, energetic executives continued to rush past me in their perfectly tailored suits, completely oblivious to the gray-haired man in the faded jacket walking silently among them. They were all just mindless cogs in a massive financial machine I had unknowingly built with my own two hands. It was a machine perfectly designed to elevate a woman who had apparently erased my entire existence from her glamorous public life. The crisp, cold air conditioning of the luxury lobby suddenly gave way to the brutal, suffocating afternoon heat of the city as I violently pushed through the heavy revolving doors and stepped back out onto the unforgiving concrete pavement. I walked steadily for 3 long, crowded blocks. The loud, chaotic noise of the city traffic rapidly blurred into a dull, meaningless drone entirely around me. I did not look back at the towering glass building even once. The burning summer pavement scorched the worn rubber soles of my heavy boots, but I barely felt the searing heat. My mind was racing at a dangerous speed, desperately trying to process the absolute magnitude of the lie I had just witnessed. Victoria had always kept her demanding work life aggressively separate from our quiet, modest home life. She constantly told me the tech startup culture was far too toxic, far too stressful for a retired, simple engineer to deal with on a daily basis. She always insisted that my personal peace of mind was her absolute top priority in this world. "You just relax at home, Harrison," she used to say, sweetly, softly, kissing my forehead, before rushing out the front door every morning with her expensive leather briefcase. "You did your part building the core software algorithm. Let me handle the ugly, ruthless corporate politics." I had foolishly believed her every single word. I had happily pruned the rose bushes in our backyard garden, cooked her warm, nutritious dinners, and kept the house perfectly quiet, for when she returned, completely exhausted from her mysterious late-night strategy sessions. I reached the dusty, unpaved municipal parking lot, where I had parked my 10-year-old Ford pickup truck. It sat there quietly, in the blazing sun, battered, scratched, and heavily rusted along the lower edges. It looked entirely out of place, surrounded by the sleek black luxury sedans of the bustling financial district. I unlocked the heavy, creaking metal door, slowly climbed into the driver's seat, and tightly gripped the worn leather steering wheel. The cabin of the old truck was stiflingly hot, smelling strongly of old motor oil, stale coffee, and cheap pine air fresheners. I did not turn the metal key in the ignition right away. I just sat there in the sweltering, oppressive heat, staring blankly out, through the dirty, bug-splattered windshield, at the brick wall of the adjacent building. I slowly reached deeply into my jacket pocket and pulled out the small velvet box once again. I popped the delicate lid open with my thumb. The expensive diamond necklace stared coldly back at me. 6 grueling months of careful, meticulous budgeting. 6 long months of skipping my morning coffee at the local diner, of repairing the soles of my own work boots, instead of buying new ones, all to buy a beautiful, sparkling symbol of my enduring, unwavering love. All for a woman who was happily playing house with her wealthy chief financial officer. My calloused hands began to shake violently against the thick steering wheel. It was not the weak, frail tremor of an old man succumbing to overwhelming sorrow, sadness, or crippling grief. It was the fierce, terrifying, burning adrenaline of a man brutally waking up from a 35-year coma. The intense shaking came from a deep, primal, entirely uncontrollable rage. The countless missing pieces of the complex puzzle. The glaring warning signs I had willfully and blindly ignored for so many long years suddenly snapped sharply into place with terrifying, undeniable clarity. The countless weekends she spent completely away on supposed executive investor retreats. The highly aggressive, complex passwords on her personal and business laptops. The peculiar, frantic way she always intercepted the Daily Mail before I could ever see the official stamped company documents. It was not a loving effort to protect my physical health from corporate stress. It was a highly calculated, malicious, deliberate quarantine designed exclusively to keep me entirely in the dark. I had been neatly and quietly boxed away in our peaceful suburban home. She kept me docile, obedient, and blissfully ignorant, while she proudly paraded around high society as the glamorous, powerful half of a fake corporate power couple. She had ruthlessly taken my fleeting youth, drained my financial money, and brazenly stolen the brilliant software algorithm I had painstakingly written in the dark basement. She had callously used my blood, sweat, and tears to build a towering golden pedestal for another man to proudly stand on. My entire life, the 35 years of unwavering devotion I had proudly worn like a badge of honor, was nothing more than a carefully constructed, beautiful mirage meant to successfully extract every last drop of my inherent value. I snapped the velvet box shut with a sharp, definitive click that echoed in the silent truck cabin. I slowly turned the key in the ignition, listening closely to the familiar, comforting, loud roar of the old truck engine springing to vibrant life. I was certainly not going to shed a single pathetic tear over this unbelievable, sickening deception. I was absolutely not going to beg or loudly plead with anyone for simple, meaningless answers. I was going to drive straight home, look my terribly unfaithful wife directly in the eye, and silently start dismantling her pristine corporate empire piece by destructive piece. This was no longer just about a broken, deceitful marriage or a stolen algorithm. This was about firmly reclaiming my stolen dignity. The final devastating game had officially begun, and I fully intended to win. I gripped the steering wheel of my battered pickup truck and merged onto the crowded highway, heading back to our quiet suburban neighborhood. The afternoon sun beat down on the dashboard, but the interior of the cab felt as cold as a winter morning. My mind raced through the decades we had spent together, dissecting every late-night meeting, every sudden business trip, and every dismissed question. I pulled into our long driveway, the gravel crunching beneath the heavy tires. This was the house I had painstakingly maintained. I had built the wooden deck, repaired the roof, and manicured the front lawn so Victoria could have a pristine sanctuary away from her demanding corporate life. I walked through the front door into the silent, immaculate kitchen. I did not bother turning on the lights. I walked straight into my small home office, turned on my old desktop computer, and pulled up the security camera footage I had snapped on my phone in the lobby. I connected the phone to my printer. The machine whirred and clicked slowly, spitting out a high-resolution, full-color image of the massive digital billboard. Victoria and Maxwell Thorne, a power couple. I carried the warm sheet of paper back into the kitchen and placed it face down on the gleaming granite countertop. Then I sat on one of the tall wooden bar stools and waited in the growing shadows of the late afternoon. 2 agonizing hours passed. The grandfather clock in the hallway ticked with a slow, methodical rhythm that matched the heavy beating of my heart. Finally, I heard the distinct sound of a luxury sedan pulling into the driveway. The heavy front door clicked open, and Victoria stepped into the foyer. She dropped her expensive leather briefcase onto the entryway table with a tired sigh. She walked into the kitchen, bringing with her the sharp, sophisticated scent of her signature designer perfume. She was still wearing the same pristine white business suit from the billboard photograph. She flicked on the overhead pendant lights, momentarily startled to find me sitting in the semi-darkness. "Harrison," she said, placing a hand on her chest. "You startled me. Why are you sitting in the dark?" I did not move. I did not offer my usual warm smile or stand up to kiss her cheek. I simply stared at the woman I had loved for 35 years, searching her familiar face for any trace of the stranger I had seen towering over the corporate lobby. "I went to your office today," I said, my voice low and completely devoid of emotion. "I wanted to surprise you for our 35th anniversary. I brought you a gift." Victoria froze for a fraction of a second, a microscopic pause that a younger, more naive version of myself would have completely missed. But she recovered instantly, her facial expression melting into a mask of soft, practiced concern. "Oh, darling, I am so sorry," she murmured, taking a step toward me. I told you things are incredibly hectic with the public listing. The security at the new building is just a nightmare right now. I wish you had called me first. I reached out and slowly flipped the printed paper over on the granite countertop. I pushed it gently across the smooth surface until it stopped directly in front of her perfectly manicured hands. I did not call, I replied evenly, because I was busy admiring your new promotional campaign. Victoria looked down at the paper. I watched her eyes closely, waiting for the panic, the guilt, the sudden realization that her elaborate house of cards had finally collapsed. I waited for her to drop her defensive walls and beg for my forgiveness. Instead, something chillingly different happened. Victoria did not gasp. She did not cover her mouth in horror. She simply let out a long, exhausted sigh, as if she were dealing with a slightly annoying, mildly frustrating administrative error rather than the absolute destruction of her marriage. She reached past the photograph, opened the custom mahogany wine cabinet I had built for her, and pulled out a bottle of expensive red wine. She smoothly uncorked the bottle and poured herself a generous glass before finally looking back at me. "Harrison," she said, her tone dripping with the kind of gentle condescension you would use to explain a simple math problem to a small child. "This is exactly why I did not want you coming down to the corporate offices. I knew you would completely misunderstand the situation." I kept my hands folded tightly on my lap, my nails digging sharply into my palms to keep myself from screaming. "Misunderstand," I repeated slowly, letting the word hang heavily in the tense air between us. "Please, Victoria, explain to me how exactly I am misunderstanding the fact that you are publicly presenting yourself as the wife of a man named Maxwell Thorne." She took a slow, elegant sip of her wine, leaning comfortably against the kitchen counter. "It is called strategic public relations, Harrison," she explained smoothly, her eyes locking onto mine without a single ounce of shame. "You have to understand how the modern financial world operates. When a technology company prepares for an initial public offering, the major Wall Street investors are not just buying our software. They are buying a compelling narrative. They want stability, unity, and an inspiring story. My marketing team conducted extensive focus groups 6 months ago. The data was absolutely conclusive. The market responds significantly better to a co-founder power couple than a single isolated female executive. It projects an image of unified long-term corporate strength." I stared at her in complete disbelief. "So you decided to simply erase your real husband and invent a fake marriage with your chief financial officer?" Victoria waved her free hand dismissively, as if swatting away a trivial detail. "Maxwell is just playing a temporary corporate role. We needed a strong, authoritative male figure to balance the executive profile for the institutional investors. Changing my professional surname to Thorne for the media campaign was a carefully calculated branding decision. The public relations firm estimated that this specific power couple narrative would boost our initial valuation by at least 20%. Do you realize how much money that is, Harrison? We are talking about hundreds of millions of dollars in additional capital. It is just business theater. It is a temporary corporate mask to ensure the public listing is a massive financial success for our family." I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer audacity of her explanation. It was terrifyingly smooth. It was delivered with such unyielding confidence, such rational, cold business logic, that for a brief, fleeting moment, a tiny part of my brain actually wavered. Could she be telling the truth? Was it truly possible that the financial world was so inherently corrupt and superficial that faking a marriage was simply considered a standard marketing tactic? After all, I did not understand Wall Street. I did not understand billion-dollar valuations or public relations strategies. I only understood concrete, steel, and structural loads. She knew my insecurities, and she was masterfully playing them against me. She placed her wine glass down and walked slowly around the kitchen island, reaching out to gently touch my shoulder. "Harrison, you know you are the only man I have ever loved," she whispered softly, her voice taking on that familiar, comforting tone I had relied on for 3 decades. This is all for us. Once the company goes public and the stock stabilizes, we can slowly phase out the marketing narrative. Just trust me a little longer." I looked deeply into her eyes, desperately wanting to believe the woman I had sacrificed my entire life for. I was almost ready to nod to accept the absurd lie and retreat back into my comfortable blindness. But before I could utter a single word of surrender, the heavy oak front door swung open with a loud thud, and heavy footsteps echoed in the hallway. Our son Preston stepped into the bright light of the kitchen. Preston walked into the kitchen wearing a sharply tailored dark navy designer suit that probably cost more than my first truck. He tossed his keys onto the counter, running a hand through his perfectly styled hair. He paused when he saw the two of us standing in the tense silence of the kitchen, his eyes darting from my rigid posture to the printed photograph lying face up on the granite island. He did not look shocked or embarrassed. Instead, a slow, familiar smirk spread across his young, arrogant face. "Dad," he said, his tone casual, completely devoid of any respect. "Mom told you about the marketing strategy, right? I told her you would probably overreact if you saw the promotional materials without context. You really do not understand how modern corporate structuring works, do you? It is just high-level optics for the institutional buyers. You need to relax and let us handle the big leagues." I stared at my own flesh and blood, the boy I had carried on my shoulders and worked double shifts to support. I was about to lower my head and accept their combined story until Preston stepped forward to hug his mother. As he leaned over her shoulder, his eyes met mine in the reflection of the large kitchen window. In that brief, unguarded fraction of a second, I saw it. A microscopic, mocking wink exchanged between mother and son. A silent, shared acknowledgement of a successful manipulation. The plausible lie shattered into a million irreparable pieces. The devastating game had just escalated, and I was entirely surrounded by enemies. I stood frozen in my own kitchen, my heart pounding a slow, heavy rhythm against my ribs. Preston stepped back from the embrace, his expensive leather shoes clicking sharply against the polished hardwood floor. He adjusted the cuffs of his pristine designer suit, shooting me a look of mild irritation. There was absolutely no warmth in his eyes, no lingering affection for the father who had raised him. He simply saw me as an obstacle standing in the way of his glittering corporate future. I forced my facial muscles to relax carefully, masking the boiling rage that threatened to consume my entire being. I had to play the part they expected of me. I had to be the slow, obedient, ignorant old man who could not grasp the complexities of their brilliant financial maneuvering. I lowered my shoulders and let out a long, heavy sigh, mimicking a posture of complete defeat. "You really think this is necessary for the public listing?" I asked, directing my question to Preston. My son scoffed softly, shaking his head with a superior smirk. "It is absolutely critical." Preston walked casually over to the massive stainless steel refrigerator, scanning the contents with total entitlement. As he reached for a bottle of sparkling water, my mind flashed back to a bitterly cold winter morning, exactly 12 years ago. I had stood outside in the freezing rain for 10 hours, directing a concrete pour on a risky commercial construction site. I took that exhausting, dangerous job solely to cover the final tuition payment for Preston to attend a top-tier business school. I had emptied my last remaining emergency savings account to give him that golden ticket. Now that very same elite education was being weaponized directly against me. He was using the advanced financial terminology and complex corporate strategies I had paid for to justify erasing my existence from his mother's public life. "You have to look at the bigger picture." Preston continued, twisting the cap off the water bottle with a sharp crack. "The institutional buyers on Wall Street want a unified dynamic leadership team. Maxwell has the elite financial background, and Mom has the visionary tech appeal. By presenting them as a married power couple, we create an illusion of absolute stability. This specific branding angle will drive the initial stock price up by at least 20%. I nodded slowly, maintaining my carefully crafted facade of simple confusion. But why use the name Thorn? I asked, keeping my tone perfectly neutral and unthreatening. Why could he not just be her business partner? Victoria stepped forward, gently resting her hand on Preston's shoulder in a display of maternal solidarity. Because Harrison, a business partnership, can dissolve, she explained smoothly, her voice dripping with artificial patience. A marriage implies a permanent, unbreakable bond. The investors are pouring hundreds of millions of dollars into Aegis Tech. They need absolute certainty that the core leadership will not fracture. Maxwell and I have to present a united front, and that means adopting a shared identity for the media. I looked at the two of them standing side by side in my kitchen. They were a perfect, formidable team, completely aligned in their ruthless ambition. I suddenly realized that Preston was not just passively accepting his mother's bizarre marketing strategy. He was an active, eager participant in this massive deception. He was the vice president of the company. He stood to gain millions from a successful public offering. And he was perfectly willing to throw his own father under the bus to maximize his financial payout. How long, I asked softly, carefully controlling the tremor in my voice. How long do you have to pretend to be married to your chief financial officer? Preston checked the expensive gold watch on his left wrist, looking thoroughly bored with my questioning. Just until the lockup period expires. Dad, he replied dismissively. 6 months after the initial public offering, we can slowly start to shift the public relations narrative. We will plant a few quiet stories in the financial press about an amicable separation. By then, the stock will be fully stabilized, the early investors will have taken their profits, and the media will not care about the founders' personal lives anymore. It is a standard corporate maneuver. You just need to stay out of the spotlight. It is really not a big deal. Not a big deal. The phrase echoed painfully in my mind. Erasing our 35-year marriage, publicly parading with another man, and treating me like a shameful secret was simply not a big deal to my only son. I had sacrificed my youth, my career, and my health to give this boy every possible advantage in life. I had built the wooden desk he studied on as a child. I had taught him how to throw a baseball in the backyard. I had worked until my hands bled so he would never know the crushing weight of poverty. And this was my ultimate reward. Total dismissal from the family I had built from nothing. I took a deep, steadying breath, suppressing the violent urge to throw the bottle of expensive red wine through the kitchen window. I understand, I said quietly, forcing a weak, apologetic smile onto my lined face. I am sorry for making a scene. I just was not expecting to see that massive billboard when I walked into the lobby today. I should have called first. Victoria's entire demeanor instantly relaxed. The cold, calculating corporate executive vanished, completely replaced by the soft, comforting wife I had blindly trusted for over 3 decades. She walked over and wrapped her arms around me, burying her face in my shoulder. "Oh, Harrison," she murmured softly. "I knew you would understand once we explained." "That sounds very nice, Preston," I whispered, keeping my voice incredibly small and submissive. "I will stay completely out of your way until the public offering is finished. I do not want to jeopardize the company's valuation." Victoria pulled back, beaming with absolute triumph. "Thank you, darling," she said, kissing my cheek with practiced affection. "Now why do you not go upstairs and get some rest? You look completely exhausted, and Preston and I still have to review some critical financial disclosures for the underwriters before tomorrow morning." I nodded obediently, shuffling my feet slowly, as I turned away from the kitchen island. I kept my head bowed, acting every bit the tired, defeated old man they desperately wanted me to be. As I slowly climbed the carpeted stairs to our master bedroom, every single step felt like walking through thick, heavy mud. The physical toll of the day was finally catching up to me, but my mind was sharper and more focused than it had been in years. I reached the top landing and paused in the dark hallway, listening intently to the quiet murmur of their voices floating up from the kitchen below. They were already speaking rapidly, throwing around terms like equity distribution, market capitalization, and shareholder equity. They had completely dismissed me from their thoughts the second I turned my back. I was nothing more than a solved problem, a minor inconvenience that had been successfully neutralized. They genuinely believed that their cheap, highly manipulative words had easily erased my mounting suspicions. They assumed I would just go quietly to sleep, completely oblivious to their grand, deceitful plans. I stepped into the dark bedroom and closed the heavy oak door with a soft, definitive click. I did not turn on the lights. I walked over to the large bay window and stared out at the quiet, peaceful suburban street. The manicured lawns and neat driveways looked exactly the same as they had yesterday, but my entire reality had fundamentally shifted. I had spent 35 years building a life on a foundation of absolute trust, only to discover that the foundation was completely rotten. My wife was living a double life, and my son was her enthusiastic, eager accomplice. They had systematically stripped me of my dignity, my financial security, and my rightful place in the family. But they had made one catastrophic, fatal miscalculation. They had severely underestimated the quiet, methodical patience of an experienced structural engineer. When you build large-scale commercial structures, you learn how to identify critical load-bearing points. You learn exactly where a system is most vulnerable to catastrophic failure. Victoria and Preston believed they were holding all the powerful cards. They believed their slick corporate strategies and expensive business degrees made them absolutely untouchable. But I knew the actual truth. I knew that every massive, towering skyscraper has a hidden weak point, and I was going to find theirs. I would systematically locate the precise fracture in their foundation and watch their arrogant empire slowly collapse under its own massive weight. They had absolutely no idea what was quietly coming. The morning after that agonizing kitchen encounter, I woke up long before the sun had even begun to crest over the horizon. I lay perfectly still in the darkness of the master bedroom, listening to the soft rhythmic breathing of the woman sleeping beside me. Victoria looked so peaceful, completely undisturbed by the massive web of deceit she had woven around my life. My intuition, a primal instinct honed by decades of anticipating structural failures before they occurred, was screaming at me with a deafening volume. I quietly slipped out of bed, careful not to disturb the expensive silk sheets, and dressed in my usual faded jeans and a plain gray sweater. I had to become a ghost in my own life. I had to watch, listen, and meticulously gather the invisible weight of their lies without triggering any defensive alarms. The devastating game had just escalated, and I was entirely surrounded by enemies. But an engineer never panics when the blueprints do not match the building. He simply recalculates the hidden loads. I decided to start my silent investigation with the most glaring anomaly staring me right in the face. My son Preston. Later that afternoon, I drove my battered pickup truck across town to the exclusive, highly guarded neighborhood where he lived. I used the completely mundane excuse of dropping off an antique wooden toolbox I had promised to restore for his garage. As I pulled up to the towering wrought iron gates of his property, the sheer magnitude of his wealth struck me like a physical blow. The mansion was a sprawling, ultra-modern architectural masterpiece constructed of imported black stone floor-to-ceiling glass panels and rare Brazilian mahogany. A pristine, perfectly landscaped driveway curved elegantly toward a massive four-car garage. Parked casually in the front courtyard were a brand-new silver Porsche and a custom black Range Rover. I parked my rusting truck near the street, feeling the immediate heavy weight of the financial impossibility. Preston was a smart boy, and he held a respectable vice president title at Aegis Tech, but I knew the standard corporate salary brackets for his specific administrative level. Even with a generous annual performance bonus, there was absolutely no mathematical reality where my 34-year-old son could afford a $4 million estate, 2 luxury European vehicles, and a permanent staff of private landscapers. The numbers simply did not add up. The financial load was far too heavy for the structural supports he officially possessed. Someone or something was quietly funding this massive, invisible deficit. I carried the heavy wooden toolbox up the wide limestone steps and pressed the glowing button on the video intercom. A few moments later, the massive front door swung open. My daughter-in-law Harper stood in the grand entryway. She was 30 years old, wearing a crisp designer tennis outfit and holding a green organic smoothie. She looked mildly annoyed by my sudden, unannounced arrival. "Harrison," she said, her tone perfectly mirroring the same practiced condescension I received from my wife. "Preston is currently on a highly sensitive conference call. You really should have sent a text message before driving all the way out here. The neighborhood security patrol gets very anxious about unfamiliar older vehicles parked on the main street." I forced a warm, harmless, grandfatherly smile onto my face, carefully masking the sharp sting of her elitist insult. "I apologize, Harper," I said softly, keeping my posture slightly hunched and submissive. "I just finished restoring this old toolbox for Preston. I thought I would drop it off while I was running some errands on this side of town. I will not take up any of your valuable time. I just wanted to leave it in the garage for him." Harper sighed dramatically, stepping back to let me into the foyer. The interior of the house was even more opulent than the exterior. Crystal chandeliers hung from vaulted ceilings, illuminating expensive abstract artwork and custom Italian leather furniture. "Just leave it by the coat closet," she instructed, waving her free hand dismissively toward a side room. "Preston does not really use tools anyway, but I suppose he will appreciate the sentimental gesture." I carefully placed the heavy wooden box on the polished marble floor. As I stood back up, I noticed Harper adjusting a massive glittering diamond tennis bracelet on her left wrist. It was a piece of jewelry that easily cost more than my entire first home. "I see you are getting ready for the upcoming public offering celebrations," I noted casually, keeping my voice light and entirely conversational. "Victoria mentioned that the executive team is working incredibly hard this week." Harper scoffed lightly, taking a sip of her green smoothie. "Oh, the public offering is just the final administrative hurdle," she replied, her guard dropping for a fraction of a second as she indulged in her own vanity. "The real celebration is happening next month. Preston has been completely stressed out managing the back-end equity transfers, so we are all desperately looking forward to the Maldives trip." I froze, completely hiding the sudden sharp spike in my heart rate. "The Maldives trip," I repeated, maintaining a perfectly pleasant, oblivious tone. "That sounds absolutely wonderful. I do not think Victoria mentioned a family vacation to the Maldives." Harper suddenly hesitated, her eyes darting nervously toward the hallway. A fleeting shadow of panic crossed her perfectly contoured face, but she quickly masked it with a bright, artificial laugh. "Oh, well, you know how incredibly busy Victoria is right now," she backpedaled smoothly, though her voice carried a slight nervous tremor. "It is just a very small, exclusive executive retreat to decompress after the intense media tour. Just Preston, myself, Victoria, and Maxwell. We chartered a private luxury yacht for 10 days to sail around the private atolls. It is strictly a high-level corporate bonding experience. I am sure Victoria just forgot to mention it to you, because it is technically classified as a business expense." The words hit me with the devastating force of a freight train. Just Preston, myself, Victoria, and Maxwell. A luxury yacht trip halfway across the globe. A family vacation where the father had been seamlessly, ruthlessly replaced by the chief financial officer. They were not just presenting a fake marriage for the fleeting cameras of Wall Street. They were actively living a completely separate, lavish existence. They were spending massive amounts of money, taking exotic vacations, and building an entirely new family dynamic, completely excluding me. I was not just a hidden husband. I was a completely discarded human being. "That sounds incredibly relaxing," I said, my voice eerily calm, despite the violent storm of betrayal raging inside my chest. "Please tell Preston I dropped by. I will not keep you from your busy morning." I turned and walked out of the massive front door, leaving the suffocating opulence of their mansion behind me. I climbed back into the stifling heat of my old pickup truck and gripped the steering wheel until my knuckles turned completely white. My mind was racing mathematically, calculating the impossible wealth I had just witnessed. A $4 million house, diamond tennis bracelets, a chartered luxury yacht in the Maldives. This level of extreme aggressive spending went far beyond a simple corporate salary or an anticipated public offering bonus. This was liquid, readily available cash, massive amounts of it. And it was actively flowing through my son's hands right now before the company had even officially gone public. As I drove slowly back toward the city limits, a sudden, terrifying thought pierced through the thick fog of my anger. If Victoria and Preston were operating with this much hidden capital, where was the money actually coming from? The public offering had not happened yet. The primary company assets were tied up in strict corporate valuations. My mind snapped to the only major financial pillar I had completely ignored for the past decade: the joint savings account. 25 years ago, when I drained my retirement funds to start Aegis Tech, we kept one single joint account open at the local municipal bank. It was the account where my monthly pension checks were automatically deposited. For decades, Victoria had handled all the household accounting. She always told me that my pension was a crucial, necessary contribution to help cover the rising property taxes and the escalating utility bills for our suburban home. I never once questioned her. I never logged into the banking portal. I simply assumed my modest, hard-earned money was keeping our roof secure while she reinvested her corporate salary back into the growing business. I violently jerked the steering wheel, cutting across 2 lanes of heavy afternoon traffic, ignoring the angry, blaring horns of the cars around me. I had to know the truth. I had to see exactly what was happening to the only money I had left to my name. If they were brazen enough to fake a marriage and steal my structural algorithm, they were brazen enough to compromise my personal financial security. The terrible sinking feeling in my gut grew heavier with every mile I drove. I pulled into the small paved parking lot of the regional bank branch. The familiar red brick building looked entirely ordinary, completely disconnected from the glamorous, deceitful world of Wall Street and luxury yachts. I turned off the truck engine, grabbed my worn leather wallet from the passenger seat, and took a long, deep breath to steady my violently shaking hands. I opened the heavy glass door of the bank and walked directly toward the teller counter, completely unprepared for the devastating financial reality that was waiting for me just on the other side of the polished wooden desk. I quietly joined the short line of ordinary people depositing checks and making simple withdrawals. They were honest people living honest lives, unaware of the orchestrated theft occurring in the corporate towers just miles away. I stared at the back of the woman in front of me, but my vision was blurred by a mixture of sorrow and pure rage. I slowly stepped up to the open counter. I pulled my faded identification card from my worn leather wallet and slid it across the smooth surface. The young woman behind the thick safety glass barely glanced at my weathered face before picking up the card. "Good afternoon, Mr. Cole," she said, her voice carrying the cheerful, rehearsed tone of corporate customer service. "How can I assist you with your accounts today?" I kept my hands resting flat against the cool laminate of the counter to hide their persistent shaking. "I need a complete transaction history for my joint checking account," I instructed, keeping my voice low and perfectly even. "I want to see every deposit and withdrawal made over the last 12 months. The teller nodded efficiently, her fingers flying across her mechanical keyboard. "Of course, sir," she replied, her eyes fixed on her bright computer monitor. "Give me just one moment to pull up those specific records for you." I stood there in the quiet hum of the local bank branch, listening to the soft murmur of the other customers. My mind drifted back to the thousands of times I had walked through these exact same doors over the past 2 decades. I had faithfully deposited every single pension check I received, trusting Victoria to manage our shared household expenses. I had blindly believed her when she said property taxes were rising exponentially, and when she claimed the utility costs for our modest suburban home were draining our resources. I never once questioned where my hard-earned money was actually going. "Sir," the teller said, interrupting my dark thoughts. "I have the records here. Would you like me to print the physical statements for you or just go over the recent activity on the screen?" "Print them," I replied immediately. "All of them." She pressed a button, and the heavy laser printer behind her desk whirred to life. As it began spitting out pages, she frowned slightly, leaning closer to her monitor. "Mr. Cole," she murmured, her cheerful tone shifting into one of mild professional confusion. "Just looking over this briefly, it seems there is a highly consistent pattern of automatic outbound transfers on this account." My chest tightened painfully. "What kind of transfers?" I asked, my voice barely above a whisper. "Well, every month, exactly 3 days after your municipal pension deposit clears, almost the entire balance is transferred out via an automated clearinghouse routing number," she explained, tracing a finger down the screen. "It leaves just enough to avoid the minimum balance maintenance fees." "Where is the money going?" I demanded, leaning closer to the thick glass. She tapped her keyboard a few more times. "The destination is a private financial entity," she read aloud. "It is registered as the Thorne Family Trust." The Thorne Family Trust. The words hit me with the devastating, crushing force of a physical blow. The air suddenly felt too thin to breathe. Victoria was not just living a glamorous double life. She was systematically siphoning my modest retirement funds to financially support her fake marriage, my grueling years of pouring concrete, my aching joints, my completely sacrificed youth. It was all being quietly funneled into a private trust fund, bearing the name of the man who was currently posing as her powerful husband. I had literally been paying for my own replacement. The printer finally stopped clicking. The teller gathered the thick stack of papers, stapled the top corner, and slid them through the narrow slot at the bottom of the glass partition. "Is there anything else I can help you with today, Mr. Cole?" she asked, looking at me with a sudden flash of genuine concern. "You look a little pale." "I am perfectly fine." I lied smoothly, taking the papers with a remarkably steady hand. "Thank you for your assistance." I walked out of the bank and climbed back into the suffocating heat of my rusted pickup truck. I dropped the thick stack of bank statements onto the passenger seat. I did not need to read the individual lines to understand the horrifying magnitude of the deception. The math was undeniably clear. My wife was a relentless parasite. But the Thorne Family Trust was just one piece of the puzzle. I still needed to understand exactly how Preston was involved, and more importantly, how he was funding his $4 million mansion. I started the engine and drove out of the municipal parking lot. I did not drive toward my empty suburban home. Instead, I drove straight back toward the exclusive, highly guarded neighborhood where my son lived. Harper had explicitly mentioned that Preston was on a highly sensitive conference call. I knew from decades of observing Victoria's corporate habits that executive conference calls usually lasted for hours, and they required absolute uninterrupted privacy. This meant Preston would be locked inside his soundproof home office, completely isolated from the rest of the house. Harper would likely be lounging by their custom infinity pool, indulging in her green smoothies and expensive magazines. The house would be a massive, quiet fortress with a glaringly obvious vulnerability. I parked my truck 2 blocks away, completely out of sight of their pristine driveway. I walked the rest of the way on foot, keeping to the manicured shadows of the tall privacy hedges that lined the opulent properties. I approached their mansion from the rear, slipping silently through the unlocked wooden side gate that led to the expansive backyard. Just as I had predicted, Harper was stretched out on a designer lounge chair near the sparkling blue water, wearing a large sun hat and listening to music through expensive wireless headphones. She was completely oblivious to the world around her. I moved with the silent, practiced precision of a man who had spent 30 years inspecting structural foundations. I bypassed the main living areas and approached the heavy glass sliding doors that led directly into Preston's private ground floor office. The thick vertical blinds were partially drawn, but I could clearly see my son pacing back and forth across the expensive Persian rug. I was speaking frantically into his phone, waving his free hand in the air with obvious frustration. He was completely absorbed in his high-stakes conversation. I crouched down beneath the sightline of the window and waited. I needed him to leave that room. I needed just 5 uninterrupted minutes to find the missing pieces of this sickening puzzle. 10 agonizing minutes passed in the sweltering afternoon heat. Finally, I heard the heavy oak door of his office click open from the inside. Preston stepped out into the hallway, his voice fading, as he walked toward the expansive kitchen to likely refill his drink. This was my only window of opportunity. I quietly slid the heavy glass door open, grimacing slightly at the soft metallic friction of the track. I slipped inside the air-conditioned office and gently pulled the glass door shut behind me. The room smelled of expensive leather and arrogant ambition. Massive dual monitors dominated his sleek mahogany desk. The screensaver was a rotating gallery of his luxurious vacations and expensive cars. I did not have time to guess complex passwords or hack into encrypted hard drives. I needed tangible, careless mistakes. I needed the physical evidence that arrogant, overly confident people always leave behind when they believe they are completely untouchable. I scanned the desk. I dropped to my knees, ignoring the shooting pain, and looked underneath the massive desk. There was a sleek stainless steel wastebasket. It was mostly empty, save for a few crumpled papers. I reached into the bin and pulled them out. I smoothed out the first piece. It was a discarded draft email addressed to the chief underwriter of the public offering. Then I grabbed the final balled-up yellow paper. It was a sticky note crushed into a small sphere. I unrolled it, flattening the creases against my palm. The handwriting was undeniably Preston's. I squinted in the dim light and read the scribbled words. The note consisted of just one single devastating sentence. Need the old man's signature on the restructuring waiver before the 15th. The old man. The boy I sacrificed my existence to raise was referring to me as a liability. But the second part of the sentence truly horrified me. The restructuring waiver. I had never been asked to sign any official documents. I possessed absolutely zero legal standing within the official framework. The pieces of the puzzle slammed into place with speed. Victoria and Maxwell were not just playing a public relations game. They were deliberately hiding assets and quietly moving massive capital into untouchable trusts. They were actively setting me up to be the ultimate scapegoat. They were going to seamlessly transfer all the hidden debt and legal consequences of their fraudulent public offering directly onto my shoulders. Once the bell rang on Wall Street, they would cash out safely insulated by their fake marriage, and I would be left holding the bag. I heard Preston's leather shoes walking back down the main hallway toward the office. I shoved the yellow note into my pocket and slipped out the sliding glass door. I walked rapidly back down the silent, affluent street toward my parked truck. This was no longer just a simple marital affair. It was a highly coordinated financial heist. My own flesh and blood was the ruthless mastermind orchestrating my ultimate downfall. I climbed into the suffocating heat of my old pickup truck and tightly gripped the worn leather steering wheel. I was absolutely not going to ever let them win this final battle. The devastating game had officially escalated, and I was entirely surrounded by treacherous enemies. I drove back to our quiet suburban neighborhood under the cover of darkness. I parked my old truck at the end of the block, killed the engine, and walked the remaining distance to our house. The grand two-story structure stood silently in the night. The lights in the master bedroom were already off. Victoria was likely resting, preserving her energy to maintain her glamorous corporate facade the next morning. I bypassed the front door entirely and moved silently toward the detached garage. This was my sanctuary. This was the only space where her polished corporate lies held absolutely no power. I stepped into the garage, Victoria's pristine black Range Rover sat in the center of the concrete floor, gleaming under the pale moonlight, filtering through the high windows. She loved this vehicle. She considered it a symbol of her executive status, completely unaware that it was about to become the very instrument of her undoing. I opened my workbench drawer. Tucked beneath faded blueprints was a small micro-recorder I had purchased years ago for a site surveillance project. It was equipped with a voice-activated sensor and a massive storage drive. I could not risk the battery dying while she plotted my ruin. I grabbed my toolkit. I slid under the dashboard of the Range Rover. I popped off the plastic casing near the steering column, exposing the wires running to the fuse box. I used my wire strippers to expose a fraction of the 12-volt power line. I spliced the recorder directly into the vehicle's primary power supply. I wrapped the connection tightly with electrical tape, ensuring it blended perfectly. I tucked the microphone behind the air conditioning vent. I snapped the plastic casing back into place. It was entirely invisible. Every phone call she took, every private conversation she had with Maxwell Thorne inside the perceived safety of her car would now be captured, time-stamped, and stored. I rolled out from under the dashboard and stood up, brushing the dust from my faded jeans. The trap was set, but raw evidence was completely useless without a weaponized strategy to deploy it. Victoria and Preston were playing a high-stakes financial game backed by corporate lawyers. I needed a predator. I needed someone who swam comfortably in the darkest, most ruthless waters of the corporate legal system. I walked to the back of the garage and stopped in front of an old rusted metal filing cabinet. I removed a false wooden panel I had installed 2 decades ago. Beneath it sat a manila envelope. It contained exactly $25,000 in untraceable cash. It was my absolute last safety net, completely hidden from Victoria. I shoved the envelope into my heavy canvas jacket. It was time to buy a shark. The next morning, I drove into the heart of the financial district, bypassing Aegis Tech entirely. I parked my truck in a garage and walked to a skyscraper composed entirely of black glass. I rode the elevator to the 42nd floor and stepped into the intimidating reception area of Bennett and Associates. Thomas Bennett was a legend in the commercial construction industry, though not for his charity. He was a vicious, highly aggressive, white-collar financial litigator. I had seen him decimate a corrupt property developer 10 years ago, stripping the man of every asset he owned in weeks. Bennett did not care about justice. He cared about winning, and he cared about dismantling his opponents with surgical precision. I did not have an appointment, but the thick manila envelope placed quietly on the receptionist's sleek desk secured me exactly 10 minutes of his time. I was escorted into a massive corner office with panoramic views of the city. Thomas Bennett sat behind a desk crafted from a single slab of polished granite. I was an impeccably dressed man with calculating eyes that assessed my worn boots and faded jacket. I did not waste his time with emotional complaints or dramatic tears. I spoke to him with the precise, methodical cadence of an engineer presenting a flawed architectural blueprint. I laid out the printed photograph of the digital billboard. I placed the bank statements highlighting the draining of my pension into the Thorne family trust. Finally, I smoothed out the crumpled yellow sticky note I had retrieved from my son's wastebasket and slid it across the cold granite desk. Bennett did not move for several minutes. His cold eyes scanned the documents, processing the implications with terrifying speed. When he finally looked up, the corner of his mouth twitched into a sharp, predatory smile. He recognized the smell of blood in the water. "Your wife and your son are executing a classic corporate freeze-out, Mr. Cole," he said, his voice smooth and dangerously calm. "They are systematically moving capital into a shielded trust, while preparing to burden you with the toxic liabilities of the restructuring. The fake marriage is a public diversion to inflate the stock price, maximizing their payout before they sever their ties with you. They intend to leave you entirely bankrupt and legally responsible for the underlying corporate debt." I pushed the heavy manila envelope toward him. There is $25,000 in cash, I said evenly. I need you to completely dismantle them. I need you to find every hidden account, every offshore transfer, and every forged document. Bennett pulled the envelope toward him without breaking eye contact. This retainer will cover the initial forensic accounting, he replied softly. But you need to understand the gravity of this situation, Harrison. This is not a simple divorce proceeding. This is a multi-million-dollar financial conspiracy involving your own flesh and blood. Once I deploy my investigators, there is absolutely no turning back. They will lose their company, their wealth, and quite possibly their freedom. Are you fully prepared to pull that trigger on your own son? I thought of Preston's mocking smirk in the kitchen window. I thought of Victoria's chillingly calm voice explaining her fake marriage as a simple business transaction. Yes, I answered, my voice steady and completely devoid of mercy. I want to burn it all down to the ground. I left Bennett's office feeling a strange, intoxicating sense of absolute clarity. The shock of the betrayal had entirely evaporated, replaced by the unwavering focus of a man fighting for his survival. I spent the day driving aimlessly, staying completely off Victoria's radar. I needed to give Bennett's team the necessary time to tear through the financial veil surrounding the Thorne family trust. I returned home long after midnight. Victoria was sound asleep upstairs, completely unaware that a massive legal machine was silently aligning its crosshairs directly onto her chest. I sat in the dark kitchen staring at the blank screen of my mobile phone, waiting for the first piece of actionable intelligence to strike. The grandfather clock in the hallway chimed 2 o'clock in the morning. Suddenly, the harsh vibrating buzz of my cell phone shattered the quiet darkness. The bright screen illuminated the granite countertop, displaying an unknown caller. I snatched the device and pressed it tightly against my ear. "Hello," I whispered into the darkness. Harrison Thomas Bennett's voice came through the speaker, sounding sharp, urgent, and devoid of his usual professional calm. His tone was tight, with genuine unfiltered alarm. "I have my forensic team tearing through the corporate filings and the background data on the Thorne family trust. We bypassed the primary corporate firewalls and accessed the deeply buried formation documents." "What did you find?" I asked, feeling a sudden icy chill crawl slowly up my spine. Bennett paused, and I could hear the faint, rapid clicking of a computer keyboard in the background. "Your wife is not just preparing to divorce you and steal the company assets, Harrison. The restructuring waiver your son needs you to sign is not about assuming corporate debt. We pulled the hidden life insurance policies attached to the Thorne family trust. Victoria and Preston have taken out 3 massive policies on your life over the past 6 months, listing the trust as the sole beneficiary. They total over $20 million. The waiver they need is to nullify the standard investigation clauses. Harrison, you need to get out of that house right now. They are not just planning to bankrupt you. They are planning to kill you." I stood paralyzed in the dark kitchen, the phone pressed hard against my ear as the horrifying reality of his words washed over me. The woman I spent my life with and the child I sacrificed everything to raise had placed a bounty on my head. I did not say another word. I quietly ended the call. I needed to vanish tonight. I took a deep breath, grabbed my car keys, and walked out the back door. I disappeared into the shadows, leaving my old life behind forever. The war had begun. The morning sun pierced the dense smog of the financial district, casting long shadows across the concrete pavement as I parked my truck in the subterranean garage. I had not slept a single minute. My mind was a terrifyingly calm vacuum, stripped of the agonizing sorrow that had paralyzed me prior. I walked through the towering glass doors of Bennett and Associates, my heavy work boots thudding rhythmically against the polished marble floor. The receptionist did not ask for my name this time. She simply nodded and pressed a silent button beneath her sleek desk, granting me immediate access to the inner sanctum. Thomas Bennett was standing by his floor-to-ceiling window, staring down at the bustling city below, with the cold gaze of an apex predator. He turned slowly as I entered, gesturing toward the heavy leather chair positioned precisely opposite his imposing granite desk. He did not offer coffee or empty platitudes. He simply sat down and looked at me with a grim, calculating severity. I took my seat, keeping my posture rigid. The thick silence of the massive room was broken only by the faint hum of the central air conditioning. Bennett reached into his deep desk drawer and extracted a heavily bound legal folder. It was stamped with a bright red confidential seal. He placed it carefully on the smooth stone surface between us. My forensic team worked through the entire night. Mr. Cole, Bennett began, his voice dropping an octave, carrying the heavy weight of a judge delivering a terminal sentence. We dug past the initial corporate firewalls of the Thorne Family Trust and cross-referenced the executive background checks with municipal public records across multiple states. When dealing with high net worth corporate restructuring, we always look for hidden liabilities. What we found in your wife's background is not just a hidden financial liability. It is a staggering, meticulously orchestrated felony. He placed his index finger on the folder and slowly slid it across the cold granite desk. "Open it," he commanded softly. My calloused fingers felt strangely numb as I flipped open the heavy cardboard cover. The very first document was a high-resolution photocopy of a state-issued certificate, complete with an embossed municipal seal from Clark County, Nevada. The bold typography at the top of the page blurred for a fraction of a second before snapping into terrifying clarity. It was a legal certificate of marriage. I scanned the rigid lines of text, my eyes locking onto the designated spaces for the bride and groom. Victoria Cole. Maxwell Thorne. I looked at the official date stamped at the bottom corner of the document. It was dated exactly 10 years ago. I stared at the paper, my brain refusing to process the impossible mathematics of the timeline. "This is a fake document," I whispered, my voice sounding hollow and entirely unfamiliar. "I am legally married to her. We were married 35 years ago in a church in upstate New York. She cannot be legally married to another man." Bennett leaned forward, his sharp eyes pinning me down. "It is entirely real, Harrison. 10 years ago, Victoria filed a completely fraudulent divorce petition in a remote jurisdiction utilizing a sophisticated network of shell addresses and forged signatures to claim you had abandoned the marriage and could not be located. She employed a corrupt low-level attorney to push the massive paperwork through a severely backlogged municipal court system. A judge signed the final decree, legally dissolving your marriage on paper, without you ever knowing it had happened. 2 weeks later, she flew to Nevada and legally married her chief financial officer. She has been committing felony bigamy for an entire decade." The devastating words slammed into my chest with the crushing force of a collapsing steel beam. 10 years. This was not a sudden marketing strategy designed to artificially inflate the valuation of an upcoming public offering. This was not a temporary corporate masquerade. This was a decade-long, meticulously calculated, flawlessly executed double life. Every single late-night board meeting, every sudden weekend executive retreat, and every supposed emergency business trip over the last 10 years instantly clicked into agonizingly clear focus. I remembered the countless holidays she spent entirely away, claiming the toxic tech startup culture demanded her absolute presence. I remembered cooking her warm dinners, keeping our suburban house perfectly quiet, and pruning the rose bushes while she was literally building a separate existence with another husband. I had foolishly believed I was providing her with a peaceful sanctuary. Instead, I had been the docile, perfectly contained caretaker of her convenient suburban storage facility. She had securely boxed me away, neutralizing me, while she proudly paraded around high society as Mrs. Thorne. The sheer magnitude of the deception was paralyzing. It required a level of sociopathic detachment that I could not even begin to comprehend. She has been living in two entirely different worlds. Bennett continued tapping a silk pen rhythmically against the edge of his desk. With Maxwell, she built the glamorous corporate power couple narrative required to secure massive institutional funding for Aegis Tech. With you, she maintained a quiet, invisible suburban anchor, utilizing your steady pension to quietly cover her secondary living expenses while funneling millions into their hidden trust accounts. The restructuring waiver your son desperately needs you to sign is the final fatal nail in the coffin. It contains deeply buried legal clauses that would legally acknowledge the fraudulent divorce and absolve the corporation of any financial irregularities, effectively leaving you bankrupt, completely erased, and holding the toxic liabilities of the entire operation. They were waiting for the public offering to finalize before triggering the massive life insurance policies or leaving you destitute. Your son, Preston, is listed as the secondary executor on all the fraudulent documents. He has been fully aware of this bigamous arrangement since the very beginning. He is not just an accomplice. He is a primary beneficiary. I slowly closed the heavy legal folder. The sharp, searing pain that had been threatening to tear my heart apart suddenly vanished, replaced by an absolute freezing, terrifying cold. It was the emotional equivalent of absolute zero. The gentle man who had carefully tended the backyard garden, who had faithfully fixed the leaky roof, and who had loved Victoria and Preston with every fiber of his being, was officially dead. The man sitting in the leather chair in Thomas Bennett's office was a hardened structural engineer who was about to orchestrate the most precise, devastating demolition of his entire career. "What are our immediate legal options?" I asked, my voice slicing through the quiet room with the deadly precision of a razor blade. Bennett smiled, leaning back in his chair with a look of deep, profound satisfaction. He recognized that I was no longer a grieving victim. I was a lethal weapon. "We hold the ultimate trump card, Harrison. Bigamy is a severe felony. Forging a municipal divorce decree is a severe felony. Financial fraud on this massive institutional scale will trigger an immediate federal investigation. The moment we submit these documents to the Securities and Exchange Commission, the initial public offering of Aegis Tech will be instantly suspended. The federal authorities will freeze every single asset they possess, including the Thorne Family Trust and your son's massive $4 million mansion. We do not just sue them for divorce. We refer them directly to the federal prosecutors for racketeering, wire fraud, and criminal conspiracy. They will lose their company. They will lose their stolen wealth. And they will spend the next 20 years in a maximum security federal penitentiary. I nodded slowly, absorbing the destructive simplicity of the plan. "I want to wait," I said quietly. "I want them to believe their plan is working perfectly. I want them to stand proudly on the edge of their victory. I want them to ring the opening bell on Wall Street, believing they have successfully stolen my entire life. Then, when they feel completely untouchable, I want to pull the structural supports out from underneath them and watch them plummet into the abyss." Bennett's smile widened into a sharp, feral grin. "I like the way you construct a strategy, Mr. Cole," he murmured. "We will prepare the federal filings in absolute secrecy. When you are ready to drop the hammer, we will execute the filings simultaneously across every relevant jurisdiction." I reached out and shook his hand, feeling the solid weight of certainty settling into my bones. The game was now about total, uncompromising annihilation. Just as I stood up to leave the massive corner office, my cell phone vibrated sharply in my front jacket pocket. The surveillance application I installed last night was flashing a bright red notification. The hidden micro-recorder in Victoria's car had just captured a live audio transmission. I pressed the flashing screen, holding my breath as crystal-clear sound filled the quiet room. The ambient hiss of digital static briefly washed over the small speaker before the unmistakable heavy thud of luxury car doors slamming shut echoed in the quiet space of the law office. I placed my mobile phone flat in the exact center of the polished granite desk, my eyes locking onto Thomas Bennett. The lawyer leaned forward, steepling his fingers beneath his chin, his entire demeanor shifting into absolute predatory focus. The deep guttural purr of the Range Rover engine roaring to life vibrated through the audio feed, followed immediately by the smooth, confident voice of my wife. Victoria sounded completely relaxed, entirely at ease in her opulent, deceitful world. "Are you absolutely sure the routing transfers cleared the offshore accounts this morning?" she asked, her tone carrying the casual cadence of someone discussing the local weather rather than international financial fraud. A deep, resonant male voice answered her, a voice I instantly recognized from the glowing digital billboard in the corporate lobby. Maxwell Thorne. "Yes, darling. Everything is perfectly positioned," Maxwell replied, his voice practically dripping with arrogant certainty. The final capital injection from the Cayman shell companies was securely layered into the primary operational fund an hour ago. The underwriters are completely blind to the origin point. We are officially heavily overcapitalized and ready for the public listing. Then came the third voice. It was a voice that sent a violent physical shudder down my spine. "Preston. My son." His voice came from the back seat of the vehicle, loud, energetic, and completely unburdened by any sense of moral conflict. "I handled the localized distribution waivers on my end," Preston announced proudly. "The legal team at the firm completely bought the narrative that we are just streamlining the executive structure to appease the institutional buyers. They did not even blink at the secondary liability clauses." "Good work," Preston Maxwell said, his tone carrying the distinct warm approval of a proud parent. "We are in the final stretch now. We just need to maintain absolute operational discipline for one more week." "I know, Dad," Preston replied effortlessly. The single syllable hung in the quiet air of the law office, heavy and lethally sharp. "Dad." The word struck me with a localized, paralyzing force. It was not said with hesitation. It was not a slip of the tongue or a forced pleasantry. It was the natural, ingrained reflex of a son addressing the man he genuinely considered to be his primary father. For 10 years, while I was carefully sanding the antique wooden toolbox for his garage, while I was quietly paying his exorbitant college tuition with my fractured savings, Preston had been calling Maxwell Thorne his father. He had fully integrated himself into this glamorous counterfeit family. He did not just view me as a minor inconvenience. He viewed me as a complete stranger, a pathetic, obsolete relic from a past he had enthusiastically discarded. The crushing weight of that single word pressed down on my chest, threatening to completely extinguish the last remaining spark of my humanity. I forced myself to continue breathing, drawing the sterile, air-conditioned air deep into my lungs as the recording continued to play. Victoria let out a soft, melodic laugh, the exact same laugh she used to reserve exclusively for our quiet evenings on the backyard deck I had built with my bare hands. "So the only remaining hurdle is securing the physical signature on the restructuring waiver," she noted smoothly. "Is your biological father going to be a problem, Preston?" I noticed he was acting remarkably sullen yesterday afternoon. He even showed up at the corporate lobby unannounced. "We cannot afford any sudden erratic behavior from him at this critical juncture." Preston scoffed loudly, the sound filled with utter, unadulterated contempt. "Oh, please, he is entirely clueless," my son replied, dismissing my entire existence with a careless wave of his voice. "He spent 30 years pouring concrete and staring at rusty steel beams. He does not understand the first thing about high-level corporate finance or legal structures." I told him it was just standard administrative paperwork to finalize the company pension transitions. He is so eager to feel useful and so terrified of causing a scene that he will blindly sign whatever I place in front of him. He always does. Maxwell chuckled, a dark, rumbling sound of pure greed. "Just ensure he signs the original notarized copies before the 15th of the month," Maxwell instructed firmly. "That waiver is the absolute linchpin of this entire operation. The federal auditors are inevitably going to flag the 5-year gap in the corporate tax filings once the initial public offering triggers the mandatory internal review. We have successfully funneled over $40 million through those secondary shell accounts to evade the federal tax burdens. The Internal Revenue Service is going to launch a massive, highly aggressive criminal probe the absolute second they realize those massive operational deficits exist. The mathematical precision of their malice was staggering. They were not just launching a highly anticipated tech company. They had been operating a massive, highly illegal tax evasion syndicate for half a decade. And the restructuring waiver they needed me to sign was the ultimate trapdoor. By legally transferring the executive liability of those specific years entirely into my name, they were effectively handing the federal government a perfectly packaged, completely oblivious scapegoat. They were designing my total destruction. Exactly. Preston agreed enthusiastically, his voice vibrating with ruthless, predatory excitement. The waiver specifically outlines that his original foundational equity in the core algorithm legally designated him as the primary financial controller during that specific 5-year window. By the time the federal agents untangle the holding companies and trace the missing $40 million back to the original source, we will be entirely insulated by the new corporate board structure. They will have their prime suspect neatly boxed up and ready for federal prosecution. Once the bell rings on Wall Street, we cash out, and the feds can lock the old man up. We will be safely watching the fallout from the private yacht in the Maldives, while he tries to explain complex corporate fraud to a federal judge. The recording captured the sound of Victoria sighing happily, followed by the soft clinking of what sounded like expensive crystal champagne glasses being toasted in the luxurious cabin of the moving vehicle. To perfect execution, Victoria murmured softly. To the Thorne family, Maxwell replied proudly. The audio transmission crackled briefly, as the vehicle likely passed through an underground tunnel, and then the secure connection went completely dead. The digital screen on my mobile phone turned black, casting the massive law office back into a suffocating, heavy silence. Thomas Bennett did not say a single word. He remained perfectly still in his heavy leather chair, his dark eyes locked intensely onto my face, silently observing my internal reaction to the ultimate betrayal. He was waiting for the inevitable human response. I was waiting for me to break down, to bury my face in my calloused hands, to weep for the catastrophic loss of my wife and the absolute moral decay of my only child. He was waiting for the broken, devastated husband to finally surface and beg for a gentle resolution, but the tears never came. The sorrow that had been threatening to drown me completely evaporated, instantly burned away by a cold, blinding white heat. My heart stopped racing. My breathing slowed into a steady, rhythmic, mechanical cadence. The confusion, the self-doubt, the lingering affection for the family I thought I possessed, all simply ceased to exist. In their place, a terrifyingly clear, perfectly structured blueprint emerged. I looked down at my hands. These were the hands that had built the foundation of their entire world. These were the hands that had drafted the original brilliant software algorithm that made their tech company a highly coveted asset. These were the hands that had tirelessly shielded them from every hardship, creating the safe, secure environment that allowed their arrogant ambition to violently fester and rot. They thought I was a naive, obsolete fool who only understood pouring concrete and welding rusty steel. They thought they could seamlessly manipulate my unwavering, unconditional loyalty to construct my own federal prison cell. I slowly lifted my gaze and looked directly into Thomas Bennett's eyes. The aggressive, ruthless, white-collar lawyer actually flinched slightly, reacting physically to the absolute freezing void he saw staring back at him. My eyes had turned to solid ice. The devastated, heartbroken victim they had so carefully planned to sacrifice was gone forever. The helpless prey had officially become the apex predator. They had built a beautiful, towering glass empire on top of my quiet sacrifices, completely unaware that I was the only person sitting in the dark who currently possessed the remote detonator. Mr. Cole Bennett whispered cautiously, breaking the heavy silence that hung over the granite desk. How exactly do you want to proceed with this new information? I reached out and picked up my cell phone, slipping it smoothly back into my canvas jacket pocket. I want to play along, I said, my voice completely stripped of any recognizable human emotion. It sounded like heavy steel grinding against frozen stone. I want to smile brightly at my deceitful wife. I want to affectionately hug my traitorous son. I want to tell them both how incredibly proud I am of their massive corporate success. I will sign their completely fraudulent restructuring waiver with a perfectly steady hand. I will give them absolutely everything they need to feel completely invincible. Bennett narrowed his calculating eyes, clearly intrigued by the cold, methodical nature of my strategy. We let them ring the opening bell, he confirmed softly. Yes, I replied, standing up from the heavy leather chair and straightening my jacket. We let them step into the brightest, most blinding public spotlight the financial world has to offer. We let them publicly claim their stolen fortune in front of all the institutional investors. And the absolute moment the celebratory confetti drops on Wall Street, we execute the federal filings. We permanently freeze the Thorne Family Trust. We release the audio recordings directly to the Securities and Exchange Commission, and we hand the Internal Revenue Service the exact routing numbers for their offshore accounts. I want them to look out from the top floor of their shiny new corporate empire and suddenly realize the heavy glass doors have been chained and locked from the outside. The quiet demolition process begins today. The next 48 hours were a grueling exercise in psychological endurance. I had to wake up every single morning and look directly into the eyes of a woman who was actively plotting my total destruction. I drank the coffee she poured for me. I kissed her cheek before she left for the executive suite. I listened attentively as she complained about the exhausting logistical hurdles of the upcoming public offering. I became the perfect, docile husband she required me to be. My performance was flawless because it was fueled by absolute freezing clarity. I was no longer a victim trapped in a failing marriage. I was a man dismantling a hostile structure from the inside. The day before our scheduled family dinner, I met with Thomas Bennett one final time in a secure private parking garage beneath the financial district. He did not hand me a thick legal binder or a stack of printed evidence. He simply reached into his tailored suit pocket and handed me a sleek, heavy black fountain pen. The ink cartridge inside this specific barrel contains a highly volatile military-grade chemical compound, Bennett explained quietly, in the dim, echoing light of the concrete garage. It writes, flows, and dries exactly like standard archival ink. It will easily pass any immediate visual inspection your son conducts at the dining table. However, upon exposure to the ambient oxygen in the room, the chemical bonds begin a rapid, irreversible degradation process. Within exactly 24 hours, the ink will completely evaporate. The paper will be rendered entirely blank, and absolutely no forensic ultraviolet light or chemical wash can retrieve the signature. When Preston attempts to submit that specific restructuring waiver to the federal auditors to save himself, he will simply be handing them an empty sheet of paper, legally cementing his own status as the sole authorizing party for the fraudulent tax returns. I took the heavy pen, feeling the cool metal against my calloused palm. It was the absolute perfect weapon for a silent war. 3 days before the initial public offering was scheduled to launch on the stock exchange, Victoria announced she was hosting a lavish private dinner at our home. She framed it as an intimate family celebration to honor the culmination of her grueling corporate journey. It was in reality the staging ground for my execution. The dining room was meticulously prepared. The long mahogany table was set with our finest silver cutlery, and the heavy crystal wine glasses caught the warm ambient glow of the overhead chandelier. Victoria had hired an expensive private chef to prepare an extravagant 4-course meal, a final opulent feast designed specifically to keep me comfortable, pacified, and entirely unsuspecting. Preston arrived shortly after 8 o'clock, walking through the front door, with Harper trailing closely behind him. He wore a sharp gray suit, exuding the manic, restless energy of a man who firmly believed he was about to become incredibly wealthy and completely untouchable. Harper was adorned in new diamond jewelry, practically vibrating with anticipation for their impending luxury yacht trip to the Maldives. We all sat down at the grand table, acting out a sickeningly perfect domestic tableau. I smiled warmly. I poured the expensive red wine into their glasses. I listened as Preston and Victoria passionately discussed the massive institutional interest in the company stock. They spoke in rapid, coded financial jargon, deliberately attempting to isolate me from the conversation while maintaining the illusion of inclusion. They discussed market capitalization, equity tranches, and early investor lockup periods. I ate the rich, perfectly cooked lamb, though every single bite tasted like dry ash in my mouth. I watched them laugh and toast to their brilliant future, knowing they were toasting with money stolen directly from my pension and my life's work. As the private chef cleared the dessert plates and quietly exited the house, the atmosphere in the dining room subtly shifted. The casual, celebratory tone evaporated, replaced by a sharp, focused tension. Preston sighed heavily, reaching down to unlatch his expensive leather briefcase resting on the floor beside his chair. He pulled out a thick stack of stapled legal documents and dropped them onto the mahogany table with a loud, deliberate thud. "I apologize for bringing business into the house tonight, Dad," Preston said, running a hand through his hair to simulate administrative exhaustion. "But the Human Resources Department and the corporate underwriters are breathing down my neck. We have to finalize the last batch of back-end transition paperwork before the opening bell rings on Thursday morning. It is just standard boring pension compliance, but they need physical signatures from all the foundational equity holders to clear the final audit." He casually slid the thick stack of papers across the smooth wood until it rested directly in front of my empty dessert plate. Victoria leaned over, placing a gentle, reassuring hand over mine. Her touch felt incredibly cold. "It is just a routine formality, Harrison," she murmured, her voice dripping with practiced maternal affection. "The corporate lawyers just need to verify that your original software contributions are cleanly separated from the new public corporate entity. It protects your personal retirement assets from any future market volatility. It is entirely for your own benefit." I looked down at the top page. The document was titled Executive Restructuring and Liability Waiver. I knew exactly what those dense paragraphs contained. I knew they were legally transferring the crushing weight of half a decade of massive tax evasion and corporate fraud directly onto my shoulders. I stared at the paper, allowing my facial muscles to slacken into an expression of mild, overwhelmed confusion. "I do not really understand all this legal jargon, Preston," I said, keeping my voice low and intentionally frail. "Are you absolutely sure this does not affect my monthly pension payouts?" Preston let out a short, patronizing laugh, shaking his head with an exasperated sigh. "I promise you, Dad, nothing changes for you." I highlighted the signature line at the bottom of the last page. "Just sign there, and I will handle all the federal filing protocols in the morning. You do not need to worry about a single thing. Just let me handle the heavy lifting." I nodded slowly, playing the part of the obedient, trusting father to absolute perfection. I raised my hands, allowing a visible, deliberate tremor to shake my fingers as I reached for the thick document. Preston quickly offered me his expensive gold pen, leaning across the table with eager anticipation. I waved his hand away, maintaining my fragile persona. "I prefer to use my own," I muttered softly, reaching deeply into my canvas jacket pocket. I pulled out the heavy black fountain pen Thomas Bennett had given me. I clicked the cap off, pressing the metal nib against the crisp white paper. The volatile chemical ink flowed incredibly smoothly, leaving a dark, bold signature exactly where Preston had indicated. I carefully signed my full legal name, applying just enough pressure to make it look completely authentic. I closed the pen, placed it back into my pocket, and pushed the heavy document back across the mahogany table. Preston did not even try to hide his predatory excitement. He snatched the paper with greedy, lightning speed, his eyes quickly scanning the bottom line to verify the dark black ink. A massive, triumphant smile spread across his young face as he shoved the signed waiver safely back into his leather briefcase. Preston snapped the brass locks of his briefcase shut, the sharp click echoing loudly in the quiet dining room. He stood up, smoothing the front of his tailored suit jacket, looking down at me with an expression that bordered on absolute pity. "Thanks, Dad," he said, his voice completely devoid of any genuine gratitude. "This really helps streamline the process for us. We can finally pop the real champagne on Thursday." Harper clapped her hands together, already completely distracted by her phone screen, checking the weather forecast for the Indian Ocean. I remained seated, keeping my hands folded neatly on my lap, offering them a small, unassuming nod. "Enjoy your evening, Preston," I replied softly. "I am sure everything will work out exactly as it is supposed to." I watched them walk out of the dining room, listening to the soft murmur of their self-congratulatory whispers as they moved toward the front door. Victoria followed them out, kissing her son on the cheek, before waving goodbye to Harper. I remained completely still at the grand mahogany table, entirely alone with the lingering scent of expensive roasted meat and spilled wine. The air in the room felt incredibly thick, heavy with the toxic residue of their massive deception. I reached into my jacket pocket and gripped the smooth, cold metal of the specialized fountain pen. The chemical reaction was already silently occurring inside Preston's leather briefcase. The dark ink was already beginning to fade, microscopic particle by microscopic particle, steadily erasing my name from their fraudulent liabilities. They thought they had brilliantly secured their golden parachute, perfectly positioning me to absorb the devastating impact of their inevitable crash. But they had failed to account for the structural integrity of the man they were trying to break. I stood up from the table, my posture instantly straightening, the fragile tremor completely vanishing from my hands. I walked toward the large bay window and watched Preston's luxury vehicle pull out of the long driveway, disappearing into the dark suburban night. The countdown clock had officially started ticking. The taillights of Preston's luxury vehicle faded into the quiet suburban darkness, leaving me standing alone in the silent dining room. The countdown clock had officially started ticking. The chemical compound inside the ink was already going to work microscopically, devouring my signature and severing their final, desperate lifeline. I did not sleep that night. I sat in my dark garage, staring at the concrete walls, feeling a profound, terrifying sense of liberation. The illusion of my family was completely dead, but a fierce, cold determination had taken its place. As the first pale rays of dawn crept over the horizon, I climbed back into my pickup truck and drove straight toward the towering glass spires of the financial district. The morning traffic was thick and sluggish, filled with thousands of exhausted people commuting to jobs they likely despised, completely unaware of the invisible corporate warfare occurring in the skyscrapers above them. I parked in the subterranean garage and rode the silent high-speed elevator up to the 42nd floor. The receptionist at Bennett and Associates nodded immediately as I stepped through the heavy glass doors, waving me through without a single word. Thomas Bennett was waiting for me in his massive corner office. The morning sun flooded the room, illuminating the sharp, predatory lines of his face. He was not sitting behind his expansive granite desk. He was standing by the floor-to-ceiling window, holding a thick, cream-colored file folder. As I walked in and closed the heavy wooden door behind me, he turned around. A sharp, deeply satisfied smile stretched across his face. It was the absolute, unadulterated look of a hunter who had just cornered the most lucrative prey of his entire career. "Good morning, Mr. Cole Bennett," said his voice, smooth and practically humming with restrained energy. "I trust your family dinner was a completely spectacular event." I took my seat in the heavy leather chair facing his desk. "I signed the restructuring waiver exactly as Preston instructed," I replied, my tone perfectly flat and devoid of emotion. "I used the specialized fountain pen you provided." Preston secured the document inside his briefcase immediately. He firmly believes he has successfully transferred half a decade of massive tax liabilities entirely onto my shoulders. He assumes he is completely insulated for the initial public offering on Thursday. Bennett chuckled, a dark, rumbling sound of pure, calculated amusement. He walked over to his desk and placed the cream-colored folder on the smooth granite surface. By tomorrow morning, that specific piece of paper will be completely blank, Bennett stated confidently. Your son will attempt to file a highly critical corporate liability waiver with the federal auditors only to discover he possesses absolutely nothing but an empty page. But that is merely the beginning of their nightmare, Harrison. The tax evasion and the bigamy charges are enough to secure lengthy federal prison sentences for both Victoria and your son. However, my forensic accounting team uncovered something far more devastating last night. We found the ultimate weapon. I leaned forward, clasping my calloused hands together. What could possibly be more devastating than $20 million in fraudulent life insurance policies and a decade of felony bigamy? I asked quietly. Bennett tapped his polished silver pen against the cover of the folder. We began tracing the original foundational assets of Aegis Tech, he explained, his eyes locking onto mine with intense focus. We needed to understand the exact corporate structure before the institutional buyers poured billions of dollars into the public listing. Aegis Tech is essentially a medical data routing platform. Its entire multi-billion-dollar valuation rests completely on the proprietary software architecture that manages and secures massive complex data streams. That specific foundational code is the literal heartbeat of their entire corporate empire. I nodded slowly, my mind drifting backward through the corridors of time. I am intimately aware of what the software does, I said softly. I wrote the core architectural algorithm 25 years ago. Bennett smiled, leaning back in his heavy leather chair. Exactly, he murmured softly. The memory washed over me with sudden, visceral clarity. 25 years ago, we were struggling to make ends meet. I was working brutal, exhausting days on freezing construction sites, managing heavy steel loads, and pouring concrete foundations. At night, I would retreat to our damp, unfinished basement. I had purchased a bulky second-hand computer to teach myself basic programming. I saw a fundamental, undeniable connection between physical structural engineering and digital data management. Both required absolute stability, efficient load distribution, and flawless architectural logic. For 3 grueling years, I spent every single night hunched over that glowing screen, translating the rigid, immutable laws of structural integrity into thousands of lines of complex computer code. I built a digital framework designed to handle massive, unprecedented volumes of medical data without a single fracture. It was my silent, solitary masterpiece. Victoria had always completely dismissed my late-night engineering work. She viewed it as a pathetic, time-consuming hobby for a blue-collar worker who lacked genuine corporate ambition. She would stand at the top of the basement stairs, sighing loudly, telling me to stop playing with my simple little computer and focus on fixing the leaky kitchen sink. But when she finally secured a low-level management position at a failing medical supply company, she desperately needed a digital routing solution to impress her superiors. I gave her my algorithm. I freely handed over 3 years of my blood, sweat, and tears because she was my wife and I wanted her to succeed. She took my code, pitched it to the executive board, and used it to launch her own staggering corporate ascent. She eventually built Aegis Tech around my foundational architecture, completely cutting me out of the narrative. Bennett opened the cream-colored folder and slid a single, highly official-looking document across the desk. When a corporate entity goes public, they are subjected to a brutal, exhaustive internal audit, he explained meticulously. The institutional investors require absolute, ironclad proof that the company actually legally owns the intellectual property they are selling. I had my team pull the original copyright filings and the foundational patent registrations for the Aegis Tech core algorithm. I looked down at the document. It was a certified copy from the United States Patent and Trademark Office. I scanned the rigid black text, my eyes slowly widening as I reached the designated ownership line. My name, Harrison Cole, was printed in bold, undeniable letters. Because Victoria always viewed you with such extreme, arrogant condescension. Bennett continued, his voice dropping into a lethal quiet register. She made a catastrophic foundational error. She genuinely believed you were just a simple construction worker. She was so entirely blinded by her own elite corporate vanity that she completely bypassed standard legal protocols. She assumed your work belonged to her by default. She never drafted an intellectual property transfer agreement. She never once asked you to legally sign away your rights to the algorithm. For 25 years, she has been licensing, marketing, and profiting from a foundational software architecture that she does not legally own. The profound, earth-shattering reality of his words settled over me like a heavy, suffocating blanket. I stared at the patent document, my mind racing through the impossible mathematical implications. You are telling me that the core asset of Aegis Tech belongs entirely to me, I whispered, my voice sounding incredibly distant in the quiet room. Bennett nodded, his dark eyes gleaming with absolute predatory triumph. 100% of the foundational intellectual property is solely legally registered in your name, Harrison. You are the sole proprietor of the algorithm that runs their entire operation. Aegis Tech is essentially a hollow shell. They are about to launch a billion-dollar initial public offering based entirely on stolen property. When the institutional investors ring the opening bell on Thursday, they will be purchasing a massive corporate entity that does not legally possess its own core product. It is the absolute definition of historic, unprecedented securities fraud. I sat perfectly still, absorbing the sheer magnitude of Victoria's arrogance. She had spent a decade legally erasing me from her life. She had married another man, funneled my pension fund into a hidden trust, and conspired with my own son to leave me bankrupt and facing federal prison. But in her absolute desperation to dismiss my intelligence and belittle my worth, she had accidentally left the keys to the entire kingdom firmly in my calloused hands. She had built a towering, magnificent glass skyscraper, but I legally owned the ground it was standing on. What happens when we reveal this to the federal authorities? I asked, my voice completely devoid of any remaining warmth. Bennett leaned forward, resting his forearms on the granite desk. It will trigger a complete, catastrophic corporate implosion, he stated matter-of-factly. The Securities and Exchange Commission will instantly halt the public listing. The institutional investors will violently withdraw their capital. The federal prosecutors will immediately indict Victoria Maxwell and Preston for massive systemic fraud. The board of directors will dissolve the company to salvage whatever capital remains. But here is the truly beautiful part, Harrison. Because you legally own the foundational patent, every single dollar of revenue they have generated over the last 25 years is technically subject to massive intellectual property theft litigation. We will completely seize every offshore account, every hidden trust fund, and every piece of luxury real estate they possess as rightful compensation for copyright infringement. They will be left with absolutely nothing but the clothes on their backs and a federal prison sentence. I thought about Preston standing in my kitchen, mocking my lack of corporate understanding. I thought about Harper sipping her green smoothie, casually bragging about a luxury yacht trip to the Maldives. I thought about Victoria raising a crystal glass in the back of her expensive car, toasting to her perfect execution while planning to bury me alive. They had systematically stripped away my family, my dignity, and my future. Now I was going to strip away the only thing they truly cared about. I was going to take their money, their status, and their freedom. I looked up from the patent document and met Thomas Bennett's expectant gaze. My eyes were as cold and unforgiving as the deep ocean. The prey had officially become the apex predator, and the hunt was drawing to a rapid, devastating close. Prepare the federal injunction, I commanded softly, my voice perfectly steady and completely resolute. Draft the intellectual property theft filings. Compile the audio recordings, the forged divorce decrees, and the hidden life insurance policies. Have everything perfectly weaponized and ready for immediate deployment. Bennett smiled, a sharp, dangerous expression of absolute professional satisfaction. And when exactly do we execute the strike, Mr. Cole? I stood up from the heavy leather chair, feeling a profound sense of absolute structural integrity radiating through my bones. Thursday morning, I replied, turning toward the massive glass window to look out over the financial district. Let them put on their expensive suits. Let them stand proudly on the balcony overlooking the trading floor. Let them raise their glasses and smile for the financial press. We execute the federal injunction the exact second they ring the opening bell. Thursday morning arrived with the crisp electric energy that only exists in the financial capital of the world. The sky above Wall Street was a brilliant cloudless blue, perfectly reflecting the boundless arrogance of the people who ruled the concrete canyons below. I did not wear my faded canvas jacket or my scuffed work boots. Thomas Bennett had insisted on proper armor for this specific battle. I wore a bespoke charcoal gray Italian suit, perfectly tailored to my broad shoulders, paired with a crisp white shirt and a dark crimson tie. The heavy fabric felt strange against my skin, and it projected the exact aura of uncompromising power I needed. I stood in the marble lobby of the stock exchange, flanked by Thomas Bennett and 4 grim stoic agents from the Federal Bureau of Investigation. The agents wore dark suits and earpieces, radiating a quiet, lethal authority. The massive trading floor beyond the security checkpoints was a chaotic ocean of shouting brokers, flashing digital tickers, and moving bodies. Today was the highly anticipated initial public offering of Aegis Tech. The financial press had been relentlessly hyping the historic event for weeks, predicting a massive, unprecedented windfall for everyone currently involved. I adjusted my cuffs, staring through the thick glass partitions. I could see the grand ceremonial podium erected at the far end of the expansive room. The podium was draped in emerald green banners bearing the sleek, modern logo of Aegis Tech. A massive digital clock hovered directly above the balcony, counting down the final minutes until the market officially opened for trading. Victoria stood at the absolute center of the stage, radiating an aura of polished, invincible triumph. She wore an immaculate white designer dress that cost more than my first truck. Her hair was perfectly styled, and her diamond earrings caught the relentless flashes of the press cameras swarming the floor beneath her. Maxwell Thorne stood closely beside her, his arm wrapped intimately around her waist, playing the role of the devoted, brilliant corporate husband to absolute perfection. Preston was positioned on her right, looking incredibly smug in a tailored navy suit. He held a crystal glass of champagne, casually sipping it, while chatting with a group of wealthy institutional investors gathered near the steps of the balcony. They looked like royalty. They looked entirely untouchable, completely convinced that their decade of felony bigamy, massive tax evasion, and ruthless familial betrayal was about to be officially rewarded with billions of dollars. I watched Preston laugh at a joke, his head thrown back in genuine amusement. He had no idea that the signature he had so proudly collected was currently dissolving into nothingness inside his leather briefcase. We moved forward. Thomas Bennett presented a thick stack of federal warrants to the chief of security. The heavily armed guards took one look at the embossed federal seals and the stern faces of the FBI agents before immediately parting like the Red Sea. They unlatched the velvet ropes, granting us unimpeded access to the inner sanctum of global finance. As we stepped onto the trading floor, the sheer volume of noise was deafening. Reporters were shouting into microphones, executing live broadcasts about the groundbreaking medical data company that was poised to revolutionize the entire industry. I walked with a steady, measured pace, letting the federal agents clear a physical path through the dense crowd of frantic brokers and wealthy spectators. My eyes remained locked entirely on the podium. The digital clock above Victoria's head hit the 2-minute mark. The crowd began to cheer, a rising crescendo of collective, unchecked greed. Victoria placed her hand lightly over the polished brass handle of the ceremonial bell. Maxwell placed his hand over hers. Preston moved in closely, completing the picturesque family portrait for the flashing cameras. The master of ceremonies stepped up to the microphone, his booming voice echoing through the massive speakers, hyping the incredible vision and relentless dedication of the executive team standing beside him. 10 seconds, the announcer shouted, prompting the entire trading floor to begin a thunderous, synchronized countdown. 9, 8, 7. I was exactly 50 feet away. The federal agents fanned out, systematically securing the immediate perimeter directly around the base of the podium. Thomas Bennett walked calmly by my side, holding a sleek black leather briefcase that contained the absolute destruction of Aegis Tech. 6, 5, 4. Victoria's smile was impossibly wide. She looked out over the massive crowd, her eyes scanning the sea of faces, absorbing the intense adulation she believed she completely deserved. 3, 2. And then her gaze dropped. Her eyes locked directly onto mine. The massive, triumphant smile completely vanished from her beautiful face in a mere fraction of a second. She physically recoiled, taking a sudden stumbling step backward, her hand violently jerking away from the ceremonial bell, as if the brass metal had suddenly turned white-hot. Maxwell frowned in confusion, following her terrified gaze down to the chaotic trading floor. The color drained entirely from his arrogant face as he registered the imposing line of federal agents and the sharp, predatory presence of Thomas Bennett. The crowd blindly chanted the final number. 1. But the bell never rang. The silence that swept across the massive trading floor was instantaneous and completely unnatural. The digital clock struck 0, but the anticipated celebration was entirely paralyzed by the sudden, incredibly chilling disruption. The master of ceremonies stood frozen, his microphone hovering uselessly near his open mouth. The financial reporters lowered their heavy cameras, sensing a sudden, catastrophic shift in the atmosphere. I walked slowly up the short flight of carpeted steps leading directly to the ceremonial balcony. My Italian suit moved flawlessly with my purposeful stride. I did not look like a discarded, obsolete construction worker. I looked like the true, undeniable owner of the empire. Preston stepped forward, his face contorted in a pathetic mixture of arrogant rage and genuine panic. "What the hell are you doing?" he hissed violently, his voice trembling as he frantically gestured toward the confused security guards. "You are not allowed on this stage. Get him out of here right now. He is going to completely ruin the broadcast." I did not even look at my son. I kept my eyes fixed entirely on Victoria. She was breathing heavily, her chest heaving under her expensive white dress, her mind desperately trying to calculate exactly how I had bypassed her flawless corporate traps. Thomas Bennett stepped forward, smoothly bypassing Preston, to stand directly in front of the chief exchange official who was hovering near the bell. Mr. Director Bennett announced, his powerful voice carrying clearly across the silent, breathless trading floor. "I represent Harrison Cole, the sole legal proprietor of the foundational intellectual property that currently powers Aegis Tech. We are executing an immediate federal injunction." Bennett opened his black leather briefcase with a sharp, decisive click. He pulled out a thick stack of legal documents topped with a bright red federal seal and pressed them firmly into the exchange official's trembling hands. "This initial public offering is officially halted," Bennett continued, his voice echoing through the silent room like a devastating thunderclap. "The massive corporation attempting to publicly list today does not legally own its core software architecture. Furthermore, the entire executive board is currently under active federal investigation for massive tax evasion, systemic wire fraud, and felony bigamy." Victoria let out a choked, desperate gasp, her knees practically giving way as the terrifying reality of his words physically hit her. Maxwell Thorne stared at the stern federal agents actively closing in around the podium, his arrogant posture crumbling into absolute ruin. Preston stood completely paralyzed, his jaw hanging slack, staring blindly at the pale, unforgiving faces of the wealthy institutional investors gathered directly below, who were already frantically dialing their cellular phones to immediately pull their massive financial commitments. I stepped slowly toward Victoria, closing the final distance between us. I looked deeply into her terrified, wide eyes, ensuring she recognized the absolute absence of mercy in my soul. "You built a magnificent glass castle using my foundation," I whispered softly, ensuring my voice was meant strictly for her ears alone. "You assumed I was too simple to understand the architecture of your lies. But you forgot one crucial detail about men who build things for a living. We also know exactly how to bring them crashing down." I did not disappear, Victoria. I just brought the wrecking ball. The federal agents immediately stepped onto the podium, pulling cold steel handcuffs from their leather belts. The reporters raised their cameras again, capturing every agonizing second of the spectacular downfall. Preston began to weep, begging the agents for a deal, sobbing about the blank piece of paper in his briefcase. Maxwell Thorne was shoved forcefully against the green banners, his rights being read aloud. The entire financial world watched in absolute silence as her majestic glass empire violently shattered into a million irredeemable jagged pieces. The trading floor instantly transformed from a venue of prestigious corporate celebration into an arena of absolute uncontrolled chaos. The initial silence that had gripped the room fractured, shattering under the weight of Thomas Bennett's explosive declarations. Brokers in expensive jackets began shouting frantically into their headsets, desperately scrambling to cancel the massive block orders their clients had submitted just minutes prior. The giant digital screens hovering above the floor, which had been primed to display the opening price of Aegis Tech, abruptly flashed a glaring red warning. "Trading suspended pending regulatory review." The institutional investors, the wealthy titans who had been promised a technological revolution, pushed their way toward the exit. Their faces pale with the sudden realization that they had almost poured billions of dollars into a historic criminal syndicate. Bennett stood immovable amidst the swirling panic, his voice cutting through the noise with the authority of a federal judge. He addressed the stunned exchange officials and the swarm of financial reporters whose cameras were still broadcasting live to the entire nation. Aegis Tech does not own the foundational algorithm required to operate its primary data routing platform, Bennett announced, projecting his voice perfectly over the rising din. The intellectual property belongs entirely to Harrison Cole. Furthermore, we have submitted irrefutable evidence to the federal authorities that Victoria Cole, operating under the alias Victoria Thorne, along with her executive board, has utilized this stolen architecture to actively launder over $40 million in a highly structured tax evasion scheme for the past 5 years. The federal agents tightened their perimeter around the ceremonial podium. Victoria stood completely frozen, her immaculately styled hair catching the harsh glare of the television lighting. Her chest rose and fell in rapid, shallow breaths. The supreme arrogance that had defined her entire existence was rapidly dissolving into naked, animalistic terror. She looked wildly at the flashing cameras, realizing with absolute certainty that her flawless public facade was currently being broadcast as a national disgrace. I stepped closer to her, invading the physical space she had so carefully curated for her moment of triumph. I reached inside the inner pocket of my charcoal gray suit and withdrew a neatly folded document. I smoothed the paper out with slow, deliberate precision. It was the certified copy of the Nevada marriage certificate. I held it up just high enough for her to recognize the embossed seal and the forged signatures, ensuring the nearby cameras caught the undeniable proof of her felony bigamy. Then I let it slip from my fingers. The paper fluttered down, landing softly near the toe of her expensive white designer shoe. I reached into my pocket a second time and retrieved the small black universal serial bus drive. It contained every single audio file from the micro recorder hidden deep within the dashboard of her pristine black Range Rover. I tossed the small plastic rectangle, allowing it to bounce off the toe of her shoe and settle beside the fraudulent marriage certificate. Every private conversation, every calculated transfer of stolen funds, and every single time you laughed about destroying my life is stored right there on that drive, I said, my voice eerily calm, carrying clearly over the frantic shouting of the trading floor. You spent a decade building an alternate reality, Victoria. You manipulated the legal system to erase our marriage while using my daily labor to fund your secondary existence. You thought you could simply box me away, extract my intellectual property, and leave me holding the toxic waste of your financial crimes. But you forgot that a foundation built on deceit will eventually collapse under its own weight. Victoria opened her mouth to speak, to perhaps formulate one final desperate corporate lie, but the words died in her throat. Her eyes darted toward Maxwell, who was currently being pushed against the emerald green banners by two federal agents. They were methodically searching his pockets, reading him his rights, in a stern, uncompromising tone. His expensive suit jacket was violently rumpled, his dignity entirely stripped away in a matter of seconds. Suddenly, a loud, pathetic sob broke through the surrounding noise. Preston. My son. He was frantically ripping through the contents of his luxurious leather briefcase, tossing glossy corporate prospectuses and financial forecasts onto the carpeted floor of the podium. His hands were shaking violently as he finally withdrew the executive restructuring waiver I had signed the previous night. He stared at the bottom of the final page. His eyes widened in absolute, unadulterated horror. The bold black ink of my signature had completely vanished. The space above the dotted line was perfectly blank, entirely pristine. The volatile chemical compound had flawlessly executed its silent task, legally cementing Preston as the sole authorizing party for the 5 years of massive tax fraud. He was holding the exact instrument of his own federal indictment. It is gone, Preston whimpered, his voice cracking into a high, panicked register. The signature is completely gone. He looked up, his face slick with nervous sweat, his eyes darting frantically between the federal agents, his mother, and me. The profound realization of his imminent incarceration finally shattered his arrogant composure. He stumbled forward, his legs practically giving way beneath him. He fell heavily onto his knees right in front of me, completely disregarding the flashing cameras and the stunned silence of the remaining spectators. He reached out with trembling hands, desperately grabbing the fabric of my suit trousers. Dad, please, Preston begged, tears streaming rapidly down his pale face, ruining his meticulously groomed appearance. Please, you have to tell them I did not know. You have to tell them I was just following orders. It was her idea. He pointed a trembling, accusatory finger directly at Victoria, completely abandoning any sense of familial loyalty to save his own skin. It was all her idea. She made me draft the offshore routing documents. Maxwell forced me to hide the tax deficits. I am your son. You are my real dad. Please do not let them take me to prison. I will do anything. I will give you everything back. Just tell them I was manipulated. I looked down at the weeping, pathetic creature clinging to my legs. I felt absolutely nothing. No pity. No residual paternal affection. The boy I had sacrificed my body to raise, the boy who had eagerly plotted to leave me bankrupt and facing federal prosecution, had completely eradicated my love for him. He was a stranger, a cowardly opportunist, who only recognized my authority when his own survival was directly threatened. I slowly reached down and firmly pried his trembling fingers off the fabric of my trousers. I took a deliberate step back, physically separating myself from his desperate grasp. My expression remained carved from solid granite. You made your choice a long time ago, Preston, I replied, my voice projecting a cold, unwavering finality that echoed across the quiet podium. You willingly participated in a decade-long conspiracy. You enthusiastically drafted the legal mechanisms designed to destroy my life. You laughed in the back of a luxury vehicle about securing your wealth while the federal authorities locked me in a cage. You traded my quiet, steadfast devotion for a glamorous corporate masquerade. I looked over at Maxwell Thorne, who was currently being forcibly restrained by the federal agents. Maxwell is your father now. I sincerely hope you guys like sharing a cell. Preston let out a loud, agonizing wail, burying his face in his hands as the inescapable reality of his future crushed him. A federal agent immediately stepped forward, grabbing Preston firmly by the shoulders and hauling him roughly to his feet. The heavy metallic click of steel handcuffs snapping shut around Preston's wrists echoed sharply over the podium. It was a deeply satisfying, incredibly definitive sound. A second agent moved toward Victoria. She did not resist. The arrogant, untouchable corporate queen was completely hollowed out. She stared blankly at the bright lights of the television cameras as the agent pulled her arms behind her back. The cold steel locked tightly around her wrists, binding her to the devastating consequences of her massive deception. Her pristine white designer dress stood in stark, ironic contrast to the criminal reality she now inhabited. The federal agents moved with swift, practiced efficiency, marching Victoria Maxwell and Preston down the carpeted stairs of the ceremonial podium. The massive crowd of brokers and reporters parted silently, watching the architects of the greatest financial fraud of the decade being led away in utter disgrace. The flashing cameras captured every single humiliating step of their long walk toward the exit doors. Thomas Bennett stepped up beside me quietly, watching the procession disappear into the heavily guarded security corridor. The giant digital clock above the balcony remained perfectly frozen. The end is finally here. I turned my back on the empty stage and walked out into the bright morning sun, finally ready to start building my new life. 6 months have passed since that morning on the trading floor. I now stand on the expansive private balcony of my new penthouse, looking out over the glittering skyline of the city that once tried to swallow me whole. The cool evening breeze carries the distant sounds of traffic. But up here there is only absolute peace. The legal demolition of Aegis Tech was as swift and brutal as Thomas Bennett had promised. Because I held the foundational patent, the federal courts granted my petition to completely seize and liquidate the corporate assets as compensation for a quarter-century of intellectual property theft. The massive offshore accounts were permanently frozen. The luxury mansions were auctioned, and the fraudulent trusts were dismantled down to the very last cent. Victoria and Maxwell were convicted of massive tax evasion, wire fraud, and bigamy. They are currently serving 20 long years in separate federal penitentiaries. Preston, despite his pathetic weeping and desperate attempts to cooperate with the prosecution, was deemed a primary conspirator. He is spending the next 10 years in a minimum security facility, learning the hard way that a life built on arrogance and deception ultimately leads to a cage. They simply lost absolutely everything. I walked away with the complete financial payout from the corporate liquidation, an immense, staggering fortune that I now completely control with absolute clarity and purpose. I did not buy this massive penthouse to boast or to validate my fragile ego. I bought it because it sits high above the chaotic noise, above the treacherous lies, and far above the suffocating darkness of the detached suburban garage where I once hid from my own life. I step back inside the quiet elegance of my living room and walk over to the polished oak cabinet. I pick up a heavy crystal decanter and pour a generous measure of neat bourbon into a heavy glass. The amber liquid catches the warm, ambient light of the room. I carry the glass back out to the sprawling balcony, resting my free hand on the cool metal railing. I lost a family, it is true, but the family I lost was a meticulously crafted illusion, a deadly parasite feeding on my relentless physical labor and blind devotion. I excised the cancer from my existence before it could completely consume me. I raised the crystal glass toward the glowing metropolitan skyline, offering a silent, solitary toast to the incredible, brutal beauty of the absolute truth. I survived their flawless, perfect trap. I kept my personal dignity. I permanently secured my financial legacy, and I emerged as the ultimate victor in their treacherous game. I take a slow, deep, burning sip of the fine Kentucky bourbon, letting the pleasant warmth spread completely through my chest as the vibrant city lights stretch out infinitely before me. The crisp night air is phenomenally clean, The entire sprawling world below is perfectly quiet, and for the first time in 10 agonizing years, I am finally truly breathing.